Welcome to the Iconoclast Roundtable. I'm your host, Sarah Haboubi, and today we have an amazing panel. We have Sarah Hardiman, free speech activist and spokesperson from Free Speech Ireland. We have Professor Emeritus Gerard Casey from University College Dublin, Professor of Philosophy and author. And we also have Una McGurk, Senior Counsel Barrister, who is no longer practicing at the moment, but obviously a very long and illustrious career in the legal world. So today's discussion is all about free speech, it's about cancel culture, and it's about the upcoming hate speech bill, which maybe should be renamed anti-freedom of speech bill. And the questions are always, how did we get here? Where are we? Where are we going to go if things don't change? And obviously, ultimately, what can we do about it? So, Una, I'd like to start with you. When we think about how we got here, what's your view of free speech, in Ireland historically?
Well, that's very interesting because some people consider that the concept of free speech is an inalienable right. For example, that it derives from our creator, our source creator, or God, and it's, over and above any laws or constitutions. Others say that it derived from the Enlightenment movement. For example, we have that famous quote often attributed to Voltaire, who was a famous French philosopher, who said, "I may disagree with you, but I will fight to the death to defend what you want to say." But what I think is clear is that it was very much in evidence at the time that the US Constitution was created in the late 18th century. And as everyone really knows, it's the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. And at the time, the founding fathers of the United States, they were very, very clever, very enlightened men. And one of them, for example, was James Madison. He subsequently became a president of the United States. I think he was the fourth president of the United States. He was one of the people responsible for actually drafting the First Amendment to the Constitution, because he took the view that of all the liberties, the one that was the most important was the right to freedom of speech, because he felt, as did the others, that all other liberties depended upon it. So that would have been the sort of historical background really to the concept of free speech. But in Ireland, we had another constitution before our current one. We had one in 1922 for the Free State. And interestingly, there was an article in that constitution which gave the right to free speech. And then the current constitution, which was the one that was drafted in 1937, which is the one that we rely on, and it's the basic foundation of law in our state. In Article 40, subsection 6(1), it gives us the right to freedom of expression. It guarantees that we have a right to freedom of expression, but it's not an absolute right. It's limited in that it's subject to public order or morality. And so, for example, the law against defamation is a classic example of how that right is not an absolute right. So that's how we got to where we are today with regard to the concept of free speech.
I think historically, it's important that people understand that it is something that's actually in the Constitution, that it is something that has been put down on paper because of its importance, to actually recognise that free speech, as you said, without that, all the other rights are actually diminished, or maybe even we can't even access them if we don't have free speech. So, Professor Casey, from your point of view, in terms of this, obviously we've got defamation. So it's not that free speech is that you can just say whatever the hell you like. And I think that's what's kind of happening. It's almost people are conflating this idea that free speech means you can be as obnoxious and as rude as you want to be. But what does it really mean?
What the anti-free speech bill does, however, is to go much, much further than the law of defamation. It will prevent us from saying things about certain categories of people, precisely because these people belong in that category, where what is being said is meant to be somehow damaging or hateful. And the trouble is, hateful is like a movable feast. Who knows what that is? And when you come to the idea that what is considered to be hateful, and this is true, by the way, explicitly in other jurisdictions, not so much here because it's very hard to pin down, or legislator and the minister on what hate actually means in the anti-free speech bill, that it's largely subjectively derived. It's what somebody else finds to be hateful. But once again, that's in law. I mean, and Una will be familiar with this, and that you have a reasonable person standard. In other words, it's not just what somebody who's excessively thin-skinned thinks about something, which is to be the standard, but what the normal person, the hypothetical normal person, thinks about something, which would be the judge. And so the anti-free speech bill is really very badly drafted. It's actually 3 bills in one. The first one has to do with preventing, denying the Holocaust, effectively. That's the bit that comes from the European Union and which the bill is meant to satisfy. By the way, if that's what the bill was doing, there wouldn't be any need for the other parts, right? But then the other 2 parts are the significant ones, okay? And so again, for your audience, I just want to make clear there are 2 bits. One is hate crime, and the other is hate speech. And it's very easy to think that those are the same thing. You go, hate, I don't understand. Well, let me explain very briefly. Hate crime is something which is already criminal under our law. So the crime element is already there, okay? But what's envisaged under this act or bill is that the penalty for somebody who commits a crime which is deemed to be motivated by hate will be subject to a higher punishment tariff than somebody who didn't. Okay? So in other words, if I steal your wallet, okay, because I just want your money, that's a crime. If I steal your wallet because I'm a misogynist, okay, and I say, God, I hate women, and they say, why did you steal Sarah's wallet? And I go, because I hate women. That's a hate crime. And now I'm subject to a greater penalty than simply if I stole your wallet. I'm going, hang on a second. Stealing a wallet is stealing the wallet. What difference does it make from the point of view of the crime what my motivation was? It might be that I don't like people who are under 5 feet tall or people who are blonde or whatever. Who cares, right? Whatever about the moral significance of it, the legal significance is ridiculous. So that's the hate crime. Hate crime, in a word, is thought crime. You're getting an extra bit on your sentence for what you think.
For what you think.
Hate crime is thought crime.
So I want to come to Sarah in a moment about the whole EU aspect of that, because I think that's really important that people understand, you know, where did this even sort of, I suppose, emanate from, that we're even kind of considering it. But Una, in terms of, I mean, I know you've already had a experience of cancel culture and, you know, being under the spotlight yourself. So just from that point of view, you know, because one of the things is that this thing isn't even in yet. I mean, it's practically in, but already people are self-censoring and things are happening already as if it is in operation. So just explain a little bit, kind of from your point of view, what happened to you in terms of that sort of cancel culture.
Well, I exercised what I thought was my right to freedom of expression when I spoke at a rally in Dublin in 2020, in August 2020. It was a rally organised to object to the restrictions that were being placed upon the Irish people by the government. And I was asked to speak on 2 issues. So I effectively spoke about mask wearing and I spoke about the PCR test. And I think I've already dealt with that, but basically I said how the PCR test was a flawed test and that the mandatory wearing of masks was not going to make any difference. And as we know, the Cochrane study has effectively established that. But in any event, as a result of that, I was cancelled, defamed, vilified, essentially by the media. But 2 government ministers started tweeting about me the morning after. One of them was the Minister for Justice, Helen McEntee, and she ordered an urgent inquiry, an urgent report to be carried out in relation to me by the chairperson of the International Protection Appeals Tribunal, of which I was a part-time member at the time. So there was that sense that even though I thought I did have a right to freedom of expression, and of course the situation is complicated for me because I also have to comply with a code of conduct in my profession, but I believe that I did that. But what I would say, even at this juncture, was that the reaction was completely excessive. It was over the top. And what it led to really was a media frenzy. If anybody who was around at that time, they will remember it was a media frenzy about a barrister speaking out at a rally in Dublin in relation to government restrictions. So I think, and basically what I would say is that that media frenzy was to a large extent driven by what I would describe as the overreaction by both of those ministers. I mean, at one point it was on breaking news. I mean, that's how ridiculous it was, because it
speaks the truth.
The truth. Barrister speaks the truth, because I can stand over what I said and it was the truth. But nobody was interested in the truth. So basically they had to find a way to shut me down. So what they did was they concocted a story, basically, that because I spoke with what were described as a group of deplorables on that rally, some of whom were members of a political party that had views on migration, namely the views, as I understand them, were that there should be controlled migration. That's not a party that I'm involved in. I've never been involved with them, or had nothing to do with them. And it wasn't a rally about politics. It was a rally about government restrictions. But that was the spin that was put on it by the various articles that were written about me in the media. So they couldn't actually condemn me for what I was saying, because that would have highlighted that what I was saying could be very difficult for the government. So what they had to do was deflect opinion to something else. So I was called a racist, because obviously if I was somebody who was an adjudicator in IPAT and I was commingling with these undesirables who had a view that we should have controlled immigration, then that wasn't appropriate. The fact, by the way, that immigration is something that's dealt with by the Aliens Office in the Department of Justice, and what I was dealing with was international protection, which deals with claims by asylum seekers looking for refugee status. It's a completely different area. But very conveniently, the media and others conflated the two, and in the eyes of the public, I'm sure it looked like I had done something very, very badly wrong. So that's what happened. But from that, I realized that I may have thought I had a right to freedom of expression, but it was being limited in ways that I hadn't anticipated. And it shows you the direction that we now know this government was going in.
Well, we've definitely been set on this trajectory. We're well and truly on it at the moment. And I suppose one of the questions is, in terms of our membership within the EU, you know, how has that kind of shaped what's happening now, where we are?
So this law, this proposed anti-free speech bill, is really the brainchild of Europe. And it is to bring Ireland into a certain standard that the EU is trying to unify across the European bloc. So other countries have similar laws. The good side of that is it actually gives us plenty of examples, most significantly in the UK, given that we have a similar system. We can look at the examples, and particularly how the police there are dealing with them. We can get a sense of what this is really going to look like when this becomes law, and have no doubts about it, it will become law. We are fighting a very, big uphill battle here. So last week, we saw a 16-year-old autistic girl being handled effectively by 7 police officers in the UK because she said that one of the police officers looked like her lesbian nana. And that is supposed to now be an inherently homophobic attack for saying someone shares a similarity, and the idea that police resources and all of that not only would be used for any circumstance, but this one in particular, it's just such an overreach. We have other examples in the UK where people share memes online. People have had tweets, in unpleasant exchanges, no different to an exchange you might have at a junction on the street where 2 cyclists, have a bit of a spat over who had a right turn. So this is the thing. We have all these awkward interactions in real life. But what if it's now going to turn into, I can call the police and say, you're cyclophobic, whatever's next, because the reality is you have unpleasant situations, but in other European countries, and UK has one of the worst sets of laws on this, you have all of these codified rules about who and what you can talk about, and you can go through what's coming down the line in Ireland, because the NGO sector here has been particularly successful in getting their interests represented in this bill. We can get into that later, but it basically means that there will be a higher protection for certain individuals under these laws when this becomes the law in Ireland, and there will be certain groups of people that you cannot say anything about, regardless of the context, or you risk having the Gardaí called to your door.
This just seems completely and utterly bonkers. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. And at the end of the day, when we look back at Irish history and the fight for freedom, from underneath British rule, is this what the Irish forefathers died for?
Well, I think what they did fight for was sovereignty. And just on that score, I just want to mention two remarks that have been made by two politicians recently, which I think are instructive of, where we have been and where we are going with this, because it shows the attitude or the attitudes of these government parties. And one of the remarks I want to comment on, it's probably very well known to many of your listeners. It's the statement that was made by Micheál Martin in An Dáil in May of 2017, I believe it was, when he was the Taoiseach, or the Deputy Prime Minister. I mean, this is a man who is the leader of the Fianna Fáil party, which is one of the parties in government at the moment, and he is a former Taoiseach, or Prime Minister of the country. And he said words to the effect, let me be clear that we in Ireland, where we stand, that there can be no doubt that we do not want to have anything to do with a backward-looking notion like sovereignty. So that was an extraordinary statement for him to have made. I mean, it was a very callous statement for him to have made when you consider that so many gallant young men gave their lives for this very principle. Not only that, the concept of sovereignty was and is protected in our Constitution under Article 1. So that is extraordinary. But I think what's really telling about this is that this shows you an Irish political leader publicly affirming and declaring his homage to his global masters. The other remark that I want to bring to your attention, which I think is very instructive again about where this government is going, is the recent remark by Senator Pauline O'Reilly in the Seanad debate when discussing the current hate speech bill. And you may recall she said words to the effect that all laws, all legislation is for the purpose of reducing freedoms, and that we must recognise that. It's all about taking away our freedoms. Now, what's interesting about that comment is that, again, just like Micheál Martin, our Constitution does not support that, because in the Preamble to the Constitution, whilst it certainly supports and promotes the concept of the common good. By the way, Pauline O'Reilly said, which I think is very important, and I need to say that, she said it's for the common good. So the laws and legislation are about restricting our freedoms because it's for the common good. Now, we know that straight out of a communist manifesto. So it doesn't accord with the preamble of our Constitution, which states emphatically that insofar as there is promotion of the common good, it is so that the liberty and the freedom of the individual can be assured. I'm going to repeat that. It's so that the liberty and the freedom of the individual can be assured. And that's the Ireland that I grew up in, because I've no doubt that the drafters of the Constitution were not only aware of the influences of the American Constitution, but they would have drafted this in the late 1930s, so they would have known about what was going on in Europe, where you had Nazism, Bolshevism, Stalinism, communism, fascism, all those isms which were about reducing freedoms. So what Pauline O'Reilly has said doesn't accord with the Constitution. The other thing that's really significant about her remark, and again, it's relevant to this conversation and where we are going in Ireland ultimately with all of this, is that on behalf of her party, which is the Green Party, she effectively let the cat out of the bag as to where they really stand, where they really, really stand with regard to freedom of expression and with regard to all of our freedoms. So in other words, as far as they're concerned, the common good takes precedence and everything must be subservient to the common good. Now we know what doctrine that comes from, and this is the exact opposite of what's stated in our Constitution.
Professor Casey, in terms of this whole concept, it looks like it is coming from the Communist Manifesto. I mean, that is literally what it looks like. And the Green Party in particular seem to be, this kind of greenwashing is the way I like to sort of see it. It looks as if it's, for the betterment of everybody, but actually it is kind of leading down this authoritarian path. How have we allowed ourselves to get to this point?
I feel like a politician. I feel like saying that's a good question. It is a good question, and I am glad you asked me that. The answer, in a sense, I suppose in one sense, is I simply don't know. I think it's complacency. I think we're careless of our liberties. We regard them as sort of obvious, and we don't really see them as being threatened. And I want to come back to something that Sarah was talking about. I mean, the concrete example she gave might seem, far-fetched and extraordinary, but it isn't. In fact, in Scotland, under a similar sort of bill to the one that we have, that's probably even worse than the one we have. Okay, they're planning to include age as one of the protected characteristics, so that if you call somebody an old fool, okay, you can actually open yourself to criminal sanctions because you have used the word old or young. Okay, and this is ludicrous. So what we're doing is, now let's come down to cases here, because I mean, what Una is talking about, the larger perspective, is absolutely germane. It is so on. But many people will say, oh, well, that's very high and abstract and so on. But it actually bites. It bites at the individual level. The average person in Ireland should be afraid of this. Should be very afraid, because what will happen is that if this bill is approved, and by the way, it actually hasn't, it's gone through the Dáil, it hasn't gone through the Senate yet. I want to point out, by the way, that it's kind of gone into a limbo at the moment, and I would hope that we will actually stall it there permanently. So I'm not satisfied that it is actually going to go through. It may. Oh. But whether or which, it presents a real danger. And the real danger is, A, that you will be like this young girl, okay, and you will find a policeman coming, or 7 policemen coming to your door. Not when your house is burgled, by the way, they'll never come then, right? But if you say something rude about somebody, they may come, about one of the protective people with protected characteristics, they may turn up. By the way, they can search your house, and all of these things are in there. They can actually search, they can get a search warrant. Any police officer can get a search warrant.
And even have access to your phone.
Oh yeah, your phone and your electronic can take it away. Now, I mean, the bill says, oh well, you can establish that what you had there was perfectly innocent. But the point is, here the punishment is the process. Mm-hmm. You're going to be preemptively punished by having this being done to you.
Burden of shift,
right?
Burden of proof shifts.
Yeah. So the burden of proof is functionally shifted, and while they don't need to prosecute every single person in Ireland. They don't need to put 3 million people into jail. They just need some high-profile cases. And then any normal human being who's got a life to live and doesn't want the police arriving at their door will start to self-censor. Every single one of you are threatened by this bill. You should be afraid.
Sure, let's look at the UK, what's actually happening there punitively to people. They're getting fines, but they're getting a criminal record as well.
Yes.
And it's for things that they've posted on TikTok, on Twitter. One girl famously posted herself dancing to a song called Snapdog, and I believe some of the terms in that would be in violation of Twitter's policies, in relation to certain words, like the N-word, for example. I believe that's in that song. And not only was she in violation of that website, but she actually received a fine for that. And this was, a tribute to her dead friend who loved that song. Teenagers and people are going to go along with trends and fads, and again, it's this pop music. I mean, it's published artistic work, and because she was a white girl, she couldn't use that word apparently. And that's a discussion that's been around for quite some time. Who can say certain things and others can't say them, which again comes back to the identity politics issue that we're experiencing with this law. But then you're saying free speech for some people to say whatever they want about anyone that they deem, because they are in the protected categories. But if you're not in one of those and you say anything about those people, then you're going to face a criminal record for opening your mouth. And, that's the terrifying. And again, like you say, there's going to be a chilling effect. People are not going to say anything, and that's the scariest impact of this. To their credit, the senators that have had the debate so far have brought this up. It is something they're aware of. However, the first vote in the Senate was it was under the recommendation of Senator Michael McDowell, former AG, former Taoiseach, Deputy Prime Minister of Ireland. He looked to have the bill extended, to be reviewed properly and make sure that if this does become law, things like hate are defined, things like incitement, which still isn't defined even in the 1989 Act, which this is going to repeal. So we have vague, broad-reaching laws, in theory already on the books, but specifically for incitement to violence. You take that and you apply it to hate speech, anti-free speech principles, now you've got a whole other can of worms. So the government parties in the Senate, for all their talk about, we should have these proper definitions, have already decided they're not going to give it several months to discuss. They're going to get it through possibly quickly when the Senate resumes in a few weeks. So that's the concern. There are several proposed amendments to this because of things that are not defined even in some of the characteristics that are part of the bill. They discuss sex characteristics. I mean, what is that? Girls like pink, boys like blue? I mean, what does that really mean? And we don't have any other legislative precedent to say what that term means. Again, another issue raised by Michael McDowell, particularly in reference to transgender and non-binary. They're referenced in this bill, but not in the Gender Recognition Act. So there's a lot of conflict here. This law, if it is rushed in, or just sort of pushed through shortly, that is part of the danger. Now, it's a good thing. It's the reason a lot of people have perked up and contacted their politicians, and politicians have said this is one of the laws for which they've received the most correspondence they could have ever imagined. So thank you to the Irish people for putting that pressure on them, and continue to do so, because they realise they're answerable to you. Coming back to the idea of sovereignty, people conflate it with democracy. In this country, it certainly is. The people have the sovereignty of the nation. And if we are a functioning democracy, they are answerable to this, and not to the European Union and its Commission, who have drafted this law in effect to be implemented here. So again, it comes back to the issue of where's the sovereignty around this issue. Thousands of people were interviewed as part of consultation for this bill when back in 2019 it was proposed in its first form, and over 70% of respondents said they did not want this legislation. So the Irish people are telling the politicians over and over again, and they did it in 2018 with the blasphemy laws. We repealed them. Over 63% of people voted for that. So we're clearly pro-free speech in this country. Our politicians are ignoring us because Europe is telling them, get in line with the standards across Europe. Well, I look at Europe and I see a very scary implementation of these kinds of laws.
Sorry, I want to make it up because I think it's important to make this very, very clear. I don't think anybody around this table is saying that using hateful expressions is a great idea. Let's all do this. Let's all do this frequently, okay? Let's pick on people because of their characteristics and abuse them. Nobody is saying that. Can we make that absolutely clear? Because that's going to be said. To be in favour of free speech is not to say that it's a great idea if everybody says horrible things about other people. That's not what we're saying. No. But there's a problem here, which is that in normal society, much of what we do is actually regulated by social norms. Part of the problem is we now live in the internet age, electronic age, and people have developed habits of speaking and saying things in the anonymity provided by electronic media that they wouldn't normally do. And there's a kind of leakage of that perhaps into the general sort of social area. So I understand that. So I do sympathize with, to some extent, with the intentions behind the bill. But the criminal law is not the means by which you encourage people to adopt social norms that will lead them not to avoid, whenever possible, using hateful language about any person, right? It's just not productive. It just doesn't work. In fact, it's counterproductive.
Well, I was going to say, surely, the more you say to somebody, you can't speak your mind, and you're not allowed to have debate, and you're not allowed to have discussion, and you suppress, all of that. Surely that pressure building up inside, that, you need to be able to think aloud. You need to be able to have discussion to be able to think. You need to be able to have that back and forth. And people sort of being really stuck inside their heads almost, not being able to express themselves. I mean, that can't be a good thing. That can't lead to a good end.
Well, not only is it not a good thing, but I would actually, not only is it not productive, it's actually counterproductive in certain circumstances. Because one of the reasons that some people, rightly or wrongly, probably wrongly, think that certain groups are privileged. Okay, and therefore they find that objectionable, and therefore they feel entitled to use hateful language about those people in those groups. Okay, let's leave aside whether or not there's any basis to their beliefs. You don't encourage them not to believe that these people have special privileges by giving them special privileges, because that simply reinforces the prejudice that they already have. Okay. Now, I pointed, and several others, we made representations to the Department of Justice back in 2019, and I made those points loud and clear, and said this is not the way to do it. That the criminal law, whatever about the intention here, which is a good intention broadly speaking, we don't want to encourage hatred or the expression of it, but it's actually counterproductive. You're going to get the wrong sort of result, and you're going to get festering. You're going to get people festering inside and internalizing resentment. And I expect to find that expression indeed in physical violence rather than simply in language. Okay, and let's face this, okay, it's much better if you have to choose between evils to have somebody call you a rude name than somebody shoot you or hit you on the head with a bat.
You refer to the sort of the intention, this is sort of good, but I have to wonder, and Sarah, maybe sort of looking at the European-wide perspective, is the intention actually good, or is there something much more insidious behind this? What are your opinions on that?
Well, let's say it's that we do want a kinder society. What role does the government have in doing that? That's the issue. We have chronic other issues in this country that the criminal system needs to deal with. Dublin in particular is becoming much less safe. I'm sure that's the case around the country. Gardaí are leaving the force, I think, at a rate of 5 to 10% a year. This is not what we want them spending their time doing. We want to make sure that they're looking after real crimes, real violence. Because that people do argue that there can be a verbal violence, but there isn't. Like you say, this is this sort of fragility that we're encouraging. So we do have social issues, and I think there is a cultural and social discussion to be had. Things like the internet have changed how we interact, and it certainly for younger generations like Gen Z, they do have a lot more of their life online. In fact, their digital life and their real life don't diverge all that much. A lot of their socialization and things will happen online in some respect, if not most respects of their lives. So maybe there's a discussion to be had in the public square, or a new etiquette that we have to sort of look at, but that's not the point of lawmakers. That's not what we're paying taxes for. So that's the real failure of this. But ultimately, this is a government's dream. And any government, right? Like it's possibly going to be a totally different party in power next time. They'll only be delighted with this legislation. That might be why there hasn't been any real opposition at all. Because if you can, let's say, not target the general people who do violate the specific categories under this legislation, you just want to pick up one or two enemies of the particular political party that's there at the time, or you might have just some issue you want to go away quietly. Like Una, you've experienced plenty of cancel culture. A lot of people have. And it might be a perfect example of let's just put that down to public good and shush it away, and this person is saying hateful things. But again, hate remains undefined. So where are we going with this? And I think it's the vagueness, the overreach. I would encourage people to read themselves Section 10 and Section 15 of this legislation, the powers that this is giving the Gardaí. You could be living with someone, a housemate, who has committed something like a tweet crime, a talk crime, whatever you want to call it at this point. And if someone has done that and you realize that you're not aware of this, they may be now categorized as a hateful person, and if they're targeted under this legislation for whatever reason, there can be a dawn raid in your home and they will have the right to seize the electronic devices of everyone in that home. So you might, you could be living in student accommodation, you could have housemates, family members who live like lives that you know nothing about through online commentary or wherever they're operating. It could be online gaming, they could be doing anything. And this is the extent of the powers. Yes. Now, while the government will talk about, or I've heard the government parties in this Shannon talk about defining hatred, defining incitement, if that's done, that's not even really taking the problems out of the bill. There's been very little conversation about the Gardaí overreach. And if the force is declining, this is the last thing we want them to be dealing with.
Absolutely.
To be a guard today, you would really need to have a law degree and have a master's in criminology. I mean, I really don't know how they're going to police all the legislation that they have to deal with. This is so complex. I mean, I agree with what Sarah said, and also Gerard as well. I mean, using the criminal law to deal with this issue is like using a hammer to crack a nut. And besides, in criminal law, and I know this because I used to be a criminal prosecutor, you must have certainty in the law, especially in the criminal law where somebody's liberty is at stake. And when people don't actually know or understand what their behaviours how their behaviours can be reacted to, or what consequences could ensue from their behaviours, it makes them very nervous. And what happens is people will start to self-censor. I believe that's the real purpose of the bill, actually, is to self-censor. It's designed specifically to have a chilling effect on all of us. They want us all to be afraid because...
I'm going to cut across you there, because it's not actually all of us. It's only if you are, not necessarily supporting the government narrative. And certainly Agenda 2030 and the UN, the World Economic Forum, etc. If you don't support those policies that are coming down the line, that will take away our freedoms, that will, because of this for the greater good. It seems that if you are supportive of those, that you can say whatever you like to the other side. So this is a one-way street. This doesn't apply to everybody. Those who've been cancelled are the ones who are now deemed to be anti-establishment, to be, the term far right is bandied around, and I think we have to mention this because, I myself have also been cancelled. I joined the club.
Excellent.
The Cancel Club. And, it was done by the interesting thing is, the people who are doing this, there's only a small number of them. They seem to be incredibly powerful and very good at inciting fear against us. So there is actually hatred against... There's actually genuine hatred against us that seems to be coming across, whatever way you would define that. But the reality is it's not all of us. This is not impacting everybody. It just seems to be...
You don't count.
We don't count. So, but the other side seem to be able to do, if they are in support of those kind of global agendas, etc., then they seem to be kind of having a free rein over the rest of us.
Yeah, but I think they don't realise that they're participating in a scheme which ultimately will create a kind of digital prison for all of us, because there's so many aspects to this, and you have the Digital Services Act, which is coming down the line. I've only just become aware of it, and it's very serious. This is another form of censorship. So what we're having here is layer upon layer upon layer, which I can deal with, because I think you have to look at this in a broad overall sense as well, because this is going to relate to intermediary services like, online marketing, search engines and social media like TikTok and Snapchat and Twitter, and all of those are going to be affected and influenced by this. One of the issues is that it wants to tackle illegal content online, disinformation. Interestingly, and this explains why the Irish government were so keen to get this new bill passed, it's going to deal with illegal, hateful speech against minorities who have protected characteristics. Now, how interesting is that? So what we are having here, and I'm seeing this increasingly, this dovetailing effect. So on the national level, we have the national governments bringing in the legislation. Then from the EU work, they're coming in with their overlay, which is dealing with the internet service providers that enable social the social media connections, because remember during lockdown, even though we were locked in our homes and couldn't get out and we were restricted on that level, at least most of us who had a smartphone could actually communicate and connect with one another. But more than that, we were able to transfer images and information which accurately reflected the truth of what was taking place. With this Digital Services Act coming down the line, that day is likely to be gone, because it involves the setting up of a digital services coordinator in every EU state. Think Ministry of Truth. They're going to appoint trusted flaggers, think fact checkers, who will have the authority to remove content if they consider that it constitutes it's illegal in any way.
Come in on that.
Of course.
I believe the journal.ie have been appointed to some aspect of that. I believe they're in receipt of some EU appointment. I'm a bit sketchy in the details, but I remember reading about that. And I do think with this legislation, my biggest gripe is actually with the journalists of this country. The Union of Journalists, they were the people who appealed for the repeal of Section 31 of the Broadcasting Authority Act, which, for people who might be too young to remember, that was a law in which people like Gerry Adams were not allowed to be heard in their own voice when they were recorded in the news. So their voice was dubbed for someone else's voice, and it was for the purposes of sort of taking the effect, maybe that, vocalization and an impassioned one around an issue could, appeal to people, or really, maybe incite, amongst other things, violence, which was obviously an issue at the time in Northern Ireland. And they appealed for that because they thought that demands, and not just him, but anyone who was impacted by this, that their rights of free speech were impinged on, and said, you may not like the guy, and there may be a lot of things connected to what he's saying that are inciting a lot of violence, but he may or may not have been directly doing that. I'm not even suggesting that he was, but it was about the fact that in a time where it was effectively a war situation, and things that could have been interpreted as inflammatory or potentially insightful, they had created a lot of laws to restrict speech just in case. And I commend the journalists for fighting for free speech in that instance. That's a much more volatile situation than we're in now. Where are they? They're not speaking on this issue. Yeah. They're very quiet about this.
But they're totally captured.
Yes.
I mean, there's clearly no doubt about that. But just on that, one of the features of the Act, which, as I say, it's essentially here, there's nothing we can do about this now. It's essentially here, it relates to the crisis management aspect of it. You're probably familiar with this, Sarah, where in the event of a natural or a man-made disaster or a health crisis, read pandemic, they have the power and the authority to direct service providers to change their algorithms and change their terms and services, etc. In other words, modify the content so that only information from trusted sources will be made available to members of the public, which means that all the work that's being done out there by those great digital warriors who are out there in real time using their phones to expose the truth of what's happening may now not get a platform in order to share the truth, because what we'll be told is what the Comasuna man is our Ministry of Truth. It's already set up, and the trusted flaggers, and now we believe that the journal, what they want us to hear. So clearly that's just going to be more government propaganda.
Well, this is all absolutely terrifying, to be honest, and I really hope that people watching this are afraid, because I think there has been a massive element of complacency, of just thinking it's not going to bother them, it's not going to impact them. For me, this is the only conversation that people should be having right now, is about free speech. Because if we don't fight for this, our children and our grandchildren will never forgive us. Because once we're herded down and corralled, and the door shut behind us, how do we get out? So I think I'd like to end on solutions, if there are any. So Sarah, what would your kind of message to people watching this be? What can the ordinary man in the street do?
Sure. So Free Speech Ireland began as a grassroots movement. That's the first thing I would encourage people to do, is to get active in real life. We're holding an event on the 16th of September, which is a Saturday. We have, I think, 1,000 tickets available, so please come along. There's plenty left. And I think that's what we need to do. We need to come together and realise that real life action and a call to to voicing our opinions on this and other issues is crucial. So that's what I would say to people, and feel free to hate government policies.
Professor Casey.
I would say make yourself aware of what's going on. You have a responsibility. Freedom is a special privilege that must be guarded. Okay, if you don't guard it, it will disappear. So fight. Okay, get in touch with your TDs, send letters, send emails. Don't let them rest. Don't let them make the excuse that they didn't know what was going on. And never give up. This bill, by the way, is not an act yet. It can be stopped. The digital services thing we can't do much about, but we can do something about this. And while it won't bring we won't be in paradise if we can stop it, at least it will be a step in the right direction.
Thank you. And Una?
Well, I would endorse everything that has been said by Sarah and Gerard, of course, and I'm going to throw the gauntlet down to Sarah again, because I do know she's involved in organising this conference in September, which I hope and we'll all be attending. But I would love to see her group organise another conference to deal with the Digital Services Act.
Yes.
I think that is so important. Very few people know about it. And I think what it might have to do, and I'm not saying yay or nay, but we may have to consider our membership of the European Union arising out of this. And as I said, I'm not saying yay or nay, but we may need to consider, are the risks outweighing the benefits?
Well, how dare you? So I'd like to thank you all for being here today, for speaking up, for speaking out, for defending the truth. Courage is never about the absence of fear, it's not about being reckless, but it's about doing what is right. So on behalf of Ryland Media and myself, I'd like to thank you for being part of the roundtable today.